Well, coming here to Vancouver and some of the other major cities in Canada, it really does bring up a great sense of emotion for us when we see this many walkers coming out to support such a worthwhile cause as JDRF and the JDRF Tell Us Walk for the Cure.
And what are some things about type 1 diabetes that the average person might not be aware of?
So I might start for a second with diabetes in Canada. With a population of nearly 34 million people, there are nearly 3 million Canadians affected in some way by diabetes, be it type 1 or type 2 diabetes or gestational diabetes during pregnancy. About 10% of that number, or some 300,000 Canadians, are touched by type 1 diabetes. But type 1 diabetes costs our healthcare system nearly 50% of the total spend on diabetes management, both through treating diabetes directly and its related complications. So type 1 diabetes, because it's diagnosed earlier in life, and you're immediately insulin dependent, is a much more challenging form of diabetes to manage. And that's a huge part of what JDRF's focus is right now, is on improving the lives of people living with type 1 diabetes on the pathway to finding that cure.
And what are the therapies that are most helpful to people with type 1 diabetes?
So at present, once you're diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, you're immediately insulin dependent. And there have been some great breakthroughs in terms of technology recently that have made that insulin dependence slightly easier to manage. So with the advent of insulin pumping and continuous glucose monitoring, people much better control their blood glucose levels or manage their sugar levels within their system. And managing those glucose levels helps delay or potentially defray the ultimate onset of complications, which is really what the ultimate outcome we're trying to avoid with diabetes.
And what are the consequences of high blood sugar levels for people who might not be aware of that?
So high blood sugar level, it's either highs or lows, but high blood sugar levels, or hyperglycemia as it's known, puts a tremendous drain or taxes on your system, and so that can lead to potential complications. So you're putting pressure on your heart, eyes, kidney, and nerve system. So you can see diabetic-related macular edema, kidney disease, early onsets of heart and stroke, all associated with being either high or low. Being outside that normal glycemic level is what really presents a challenge for those living with all forms of diabetes.
And what about the low blood sugar levels?
So low blood sugars is an added challenge to being outside that normal range, can unfortunately lead to very serious immediate and short-term consequences. So somebody who's low for too long can slip into a diabetic coma or suffer diabetic ketoacidosis, and hopefully with intervention by another individual who can give them some sugars and bring them back to that normal range, will restore back to a normal glycemic level. If they don't, diabetic coma can ultimately lead to death, very sadly.
And what about islet transplantation? Where's that at right now?
So islet transplantation, which is another of those great Canadian breakthroughs in the history of diabetes research here in Canada, look back to Banting and Best, the discovery of insulin. The next great marker that's known throughout the world that diabetes progress, or diabetes research progress, was something called the Edmonton Protocol, discovered by Dr. Shapiro and others in Edmonton in around 2000. So islet cell transplantation takes cadaveric islet cells and transplants them into somebody living with type 1 diabetes. To date, of the 160-odd islet cell transplants that have been done in Edmonton, they've only been done in what are known as brittle type 1 diabetics, or people who are starting to suffer complications from type 1 diabetes. Because while that can make you insulin independent for a number of years after the transplant, you still have to take anti-rejection drugs which suppress the immune system. So one of the biggest challenges with type 1 diabetes is there's an autoimmune response that destroys your insulin-producing beta cells. And now, even with an islet cell transplant, that autoimmune response still exists. So while islet transplantation can cure somebody for the moment of diabetes, if you consider becoming insulin independent a cure, you still have to suppress that autoimmune response, and eventually it will destroy those islets that are transplanted. So until we either have an unlimited supply of islets for transplant, or figure out the perfect way of suppressing autoimmune response, islet transplantation is tremendously forward, but it's not the ultimate solution we're looking for.